She was 19 and owned nothing but the clothes on her back and the memory of a father who understood metal. Her stepfather had given her $10 and told her not to return, his words as cold and final as a banker's ledger. And with one of those silver dollars, she bought a derelict assay office in a forgotten Nevada town called Pinto Creek, a place where hope had long since dried up and blown away with the dust. But what nobody knew, least of all the men who laughed at the sale, was that inside the office's sealed iron safe was a secret that could unmake the fortunes of powerful men and build a new life for a girl they had all dismissed. What she found there would change everything. If you appreciate stories of quiet strength and hidden value, consider following our channel for more tales of resilience and discovery. Clara Voss grew up in the warm, breathing presence of her father's blacksmith shop, a world defined by the rhythmic clang of the hammer and the sharp, clean scent of quenched steel. Her father, Thomas Voss, was a man of few words but profound skill, his hands, though calloused and seamed with black, capable of a gentleness that could coax a perfect scroll from a bar of iron or set a horseshoe with surgical precision. He did not have a son to pass his trade to, and so he taught Clara. While other girls learned stitching and baking, Clara learned the language of fire. She learned to read the shifting colors of heated metal, from the dull cherry red of forging temperature to the bright, almost white heat of a welding forge. She learned the distinct ring of sound steel, the dull thud of flawed iron, and the heft and character of ores, the dense weight of galena, the peacock shimmer of chalcopyrite, the deceptive lightness of sphalerite that often hid veins of silver. He taught her that every piece of metal had a history and a nature, and that the patient hand could reveal it. Her most treasured possession was a small wolf's head, no bigger than her thumb, that he had forged for her from a piece of scrap rail steel. Its tiny ears were alert, its snout sharp, and its eyes seemed to hold a deep, knowing patience. It was a perfect, intricate thing, and she kept it always in her pocket, a solid, tangible piece of his love. When Clara was 17, the coal dust that had given her father his living finally claimed his lungs. His passing was quiet, a slow fading that left a silence in the forge and in Clara's life that felt vast and permanent. Her mother, a woman who had always seemed overwhelmed by the grime and noise of her husband's work, remarried within the year. Her new husband was a man named Silas Croft, a merchant who dealt in dry goods and quiet sums, a man who saw the forge not as a place of creation, but as a dirty, unprofitable parcel of land. He sold it, along with the family home, without a word to Clara. He saw her as a relic of a life he was eager to erase, an unladylike girl with smudges of soot on her hands and a disconcerting way of looking at things as if she were weighing them. Her competence was an affront to his sense of order, and her quiet grief for her father was a judgment he could not abide. He wanted a daughter who was soft and pliable, not one who knew the breaking point of tempered steel. The end of her life there came not with a shout, but with a quiet, administrative finality that was far more cruel. The day Silas cast her out was a Tuesday in late autumn, the air holding the first sharp bite of the coming winter. He sat her down at the polished oak table in the kitchen, the same table where her father had once explained the principles of flux and oxidation. Her mother was present but absent, her gaze fixed on her own tightly clasped hands, a silent accomplice to the dismantling of her daughter's world. Silas laid a piece of paper on the table, a deed of sale, its ink still dark and official. "The properties are sold, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Your mother and I will be moving to a smaller, more respectable home in the city." He did not look at her as he spoke. He pushed 10 silver dollars across the smooth wood surface, the coins making a small, dismissive clatter. "This is what is left for you. I have arranged for your passage on the eastbound stage. It leaves at dawn. Your bag should be packed." There was no room for argument, no space for appeal. It was a transaction, as simple and as brutal as foreclosing on a debt. Clara looked at her mother, whose eyes remained downcast, a faint tremor in her hands, the only sign of the betrayal taking place. Clara felt no tears, only a cold, hardening resolve, like steel being plunged into a slack tub. She looked at the $10, her entire inheritance. She nodded once, a sharp, definite motion. She rose from the table, went to her small room, and packed her few belongings: a spare calico dress, her father's whetstone, and the small iron wolf. She placed the 10 silver dollars carefully in her pocket and did not look back. The journey was a long, rattling affair, a slow erasure of the life she had known. The stagecoach smelled of dust, old leather, and the unwashed bodies of her fellow travelers. For 3 days, she sat staring out at the passing landscape of Nevada, a vast, indifferent expanse of sagebrush and pale, sun-bleached mountains. The other passengers spoke in low murmurs, their lives and destinations a world away from her own. She was an island of silence, her hand in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the cool, solid shape of the iron wolf. She had no destination in mind, only a deep, instinctual need to find a place where she could be still, a place no one would think to look for her. On the 3rd day, the driver pointed with his whip toward a collection of weathered buildings huddled in a shallow, wind-scoured valley. "Pinto Creek," he announced to the coach at large. "Used to be a silver camp. Went bust 20 years back. Ain't much there now but ghosts and old-timers." The words resonated with something inside Clara. A place of ghosts. A place that was finished. It sounded like a refuge. When the coach stopped to water the horses, she gathered her small bag. "I'll be getting off here," she told the driver, her voice steady. He looked at her, a 19-year-old girl alone, with a flicker of concern. "Ain't nothing for you here, miss." She simply handed him the fare and stepped down into the dust of Pinto Creek's main street. The coach rumbled away, leaving her in a profound silence, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the eaves of the derelict buildings. She looked up and down the street, at the boarded-up saloons, the faded glory of a hotel with shattered windows, and the general store where a few old men sat on the porch like statues. It was a town that had been abandoned by fortune, a place left to crumble back into the earth, and in its desolation, Clara felt the first stirrings of something that was not quite hope, but a sense of possibility. It was a place where things were broken, and she knew how to fix things. She spent her first few days sleeping in a stable, paying the owner a few cents for the privilege, and took her meals at the boarding house run by a stern but not unkind woman named Martha. Clara listened more than she spoke, gathering the town's history from the conversations of the old prospectors who were its primary residents. They spoke of the big silver strike of '64, the boom that had built the town, and the sudden, inexplicable bust in '66 when the main vein, the serpent's tooth, had supposedly pinched out. The mine had been owned by a syndicate from back east, and its failure had ruined nearly everyone. The town had been dying a slow death ever since. On her 3rd day, her explorations led her to a small, solid-looking building at the end of the main street, set slightly apart from the others. It was built of thick granite blocks and sturdy timber, with iron bars on its windows. A weathered sign, barely legible, hung above the door. Pinto Creek Assay Office. Elias Thorne, assayer. The place was a fortress in miniature, built to protect the secrets of the earth. It was locked tight, but peering through a grimy window, Clara could see the interior, coated in a thick layer of dust. There was a counter, shelves of empty crucibles and glassware, and a cold, silent furnace. And against the back wall, there was a safe. It was a large, black, iron-bound Herkimer model, its dial gleaming dully in the faint light. It was the most solid, permanent thing she had seen in months. An idea, bold and perhaps foolish, began to form in her mind. She found the man who acted as the town's mayor and land agent, a Mr. Henderson. He was a portly man with a lazy eye who seemed amused by her inquiry. "The old Thorne place?" he chuckled. "Been empty since Thorne was killed, nigh on 20 years ago. Syndicate owns the land, but the buildings reverted to the county for back taxes. Worthless." "I'd like to buy it," Clara said plainly. Henderson looked at her as if she were mad. "What for? That safe is locked tight. Thorne's nephew came out years ago, couldn't get it open. Hired a man from Carson City, he couldn't either. It's empty, most likely." "Even so," Clara insisted. "I want it." He saw the resolve in her young face and shrugged, seeing an opportunity for an easy dollar and a good story. "All right, girl. $1 silver, and it's yours. You file the deed yourself." The transaction was conducted on the porch of the general store, witnessed by the silent old-timers. Henderson scribbled out a bill of sale on a piece of scrap paper. Clara handed him one of the 9 silver coins she had left. He took it, bit it theatrically, and winked at the onlookers. "Sold," he declared, "to the young lady with more money than sense." They laughed. Clara ignored them. She took the heavy iron key and the flimsy piece of paper and walked to her new property. She owned a building. She owned a locked safe. She owned a place to begin. The first week was about reclamation. Clara swept out the thick carpets of dust and grime, the accumulated stillness of 2 decades. She scrubbed the floors and the thick oak counter, her movements methodical and tireless. The air, once stale with the ghost of old chemical fires and forgotten minerals, slowly began to smell of lye soap and damp wood. She found a small cot in a back room and made her bed there, the barred windows and solid stone walls giving her a sense of security she hadn't felt since her father's death. But all her work, all her thoughts, orbited the silent black safe in the corner. It was a Herkimer double-bolt fire and burglar-proof, a name stamped on a small brass plate above the dial. It stood 5 feet high, a solid block of iron and steel that defied entry. She knew from her father's work that brute force would be useless. It would ruin the contents and likely the safe itself. The lock was a puzzle, a machine of exquisite precision, and it demanded a similar precision to be opened. She had no combination, no key beyond the one for the office door. All she had was what her father had taught her, an understanding of metal, a feel for mechanics, and an almost infinite wellspring of patience. She began her work. Each morning, she would sit on a low stool before the great iron door, her fingers resting lightly on the cold brass dial. She would close her eyes and just listen, turning the dial with a slowness that was almost meditative. She was listening for the tumblers, for the faintest whisper of metal on metal, the almost imperceptible click as a gate aligned. Her father had once told her that every lock had a voice. You just had to be quiet enough to hear it. For days, there was nothing but the smooth, oily whir of the mechanism. She learned its rhythm, the feel of its movement. She bought a cheap physician's stethoscope from the town's young doctor, a man named Alistair Finch, who regarded her with a kind of weary pity. With the bell of the stethoscope pressed against the cold iron, the world of the lock opened up to her. The whir became a series of distinct sounds, a complex, mechanical language. She began to chart the sounds, making small chalk marks on the floor, noting the numbers where the clicks were loudest, where the tumblers seemed to settle. The old men from the general store would sometimes stop and peer in the window, shaking their heads at the sight of the girl with the listening device pressed to the safe, lost in concentration. They saw obsession, a fool's errand. Clara heard a conversation. It was a slow, painstaking process of translation. She learned to feel for the slightest change in resistance in the dial, the tiny vibration that signaled a tumbler falling into place. After 2 weeks, she found the first number. a subtle, satisfying snick at 82. She wrote it down, her heart pounding with a quiet triumph. The second number took another week, a faint click at 34 that she almost missed. The third was the most elusive. Days passed. Her food ran low, but she barely noticed. The world had shrunk to the space between her ear and the cold iron door. Then, on the 23rd day, as a cold dawn broke over the mountains, she heard it. A deep, resonant thunk as the final tumbler aligned at 51. She held her breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the heavy handle. It resisted for a moment, then moved with a groan of long disused metal. The bolts retracted. The heavy door swung open. The air that drifted out was cold and dry, smelling of paper and stone. It was not empty. Inside, there was no treasure, no neat stacks of gold coin or glittering bars of silver. The top shelf held a dozen small canvas bags, each tied with string and affixed with a small yellowed paper tag. Below them sat a thick, leather-bound ledger, and resting on top of the ledger was a long, sealed envelope of heavy manila paper. The address on it was not written to a person, but to a quality. In a neat, careful hand, it read, "To the one who has patience." Clara's hands were steady as she lifted the envelope. The paper was dry and brittle with age. She broke the wax seal, the sound loud in the silent room. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in the same precise script. She sat on the floor, the open safe door beside her, and began to read. "If you are reading this," it began, "then you have succeeded where others have failed, and for that you have my respect. My name is Elias Thorne. I was the assayer in this office from the spring of 1864 until, I expect, the autumn of 1866. If you have found this, it is likely that I am dead, and not by accident." The words sent a chill through Clara. She read on as Thorne detailed the story of the Serpent's Tooth mine. He explained that the initial assays were astonishing, showing a vein of silver so rich it promised to make the town a new Comstock. But the syndicate that owned the mine, a group of investors led by a ruthless man named Alistair Finch, had other plans. They wanted not just the mine's profits, but the mine itself, and all the surrounding land, for pennies on the dollar. "Mr. Finch and his associates," Thorne wrote, "paid me a visit. They instructed me to begin falsifying my reports. They wanted the official assays to show the vein thinning, becoming worthless. They wanted to create a panic, to drive the value of the mine and the town into the ground so they could buy it all." Thorne explained his dilemma. If he refused, they would kill him and find another assayer. If he complied, he would be betraying every prospector and merchant who had staked their future on his honesty. So he devised a third option. He did as they asked, producing fraudulent reports that declared the mine a bust. But secretly, he continued to take true samples, assaying them in the dead of night. Each of the canvas bags in the safe, he explained, contained a true ore sample from deep within the Serpent's Tooth, each one tagged with the date and the precise location within the mine from which it was taken. The ledger contained the true assay results, a meticulous record of a vast and continuing silver deposit. "The samples in this safe are the proof," he wrote. "The ore is not lead and zinc, as my public reports claimed, but high-grade silver sulfide and native silver. The vein does not pinch out, it widens. Finch and his men stole this valley. They murdered a town for their own greed. I have kept this record in the hope that one day, someone with the patience to open this safe and the courage to see justice done will find it. I suspect they will not let me live long enough to profit from my part in their scheme. This record is my only confession and my only hope for this town's redemption. Do with it what you will. Be careful. These are not men who forgive." Clara looked from the letter to the small, heavy bags of ore. She lifted one and untied the string. Inside, the rock was not the dull gray of common stone. It was threaded with brilliant, wiry veins of pure, elemental silver, gleaming even in the dusty light. Her father had shown her samples just like it, telling her it was the kind of ore men dreamed of. Elias Thorne had not been lying. She held in her hands not just a rock, but the truth. A truth that had been locked away for 20 years, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. The discovery shifted something fundamental inside Clara. The focus on survival, on the simple mechanics of shelter and food, was replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. This was no longer just about her. It was about Elias Thorne, about the ruined town, and about a profound, calculated injustice. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that knowledge was only potential power. To make it real, she needed allies, and she needed a plan. Her methodical nature, honed in the forge, took over. She could not simply walk to the town sheriff. Finch's influence would surely extend that far. She had to build a case as carefully as her father would build a complex piece of ironwork, one layer at a time. Her first step was to seek out someone who understood the local ground, a man who had been there from the beginning. The old prospectors at the general store spoke in hushed, reverent tones of a man named Jebediah Stone, who lived in a small cabin up in the hills. He was one of the original discoverers of the serpent's tooth, a man who had lost everything in the bust. Clara packed one of the smaller ore samples in her bag and made the long walk up the winding trail to his cabin. Jebediah was a man weathered like the landscape, his face a map of sun and disappointment. He was wary of her at first, but when she unwrapped the piece of ore and placed it in his hand, his expression changed. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing the glittering veins of silver. A low whistle escaped his lips. "Sweet Mary," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I ain't seen ore like this in 20 years, not since the first strike. Where did you get this?" Clara told him everything. She didn't show him the letter, not yet, but she told him about the safe and the samples. He listened, his gaze sharp and intense. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, staring out at the valley where the abandoned mine works scarred the mountainside. "Finch," he finally said, the name a curse on his tongue. "We always suspected something was wrong. It didn't make sense, a vein like that just vanishing." He looked at Clara, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the hope he must have felt as a young man. "What do you aim to do, girl?" "I aim to prove it," she said. Jebediah nodded slowly. He went inside his cabin and returned with a rolled-up, yellowed map of the mine's tunnels. "Thorne marked his sample locations," he said. "If you can show me those on his ledger, I can show you where they are on this map. I can testify where I myself saw ore just like this, before they ran us all off." He was her first ally. Her second came from an unexpected place. The town doctor, the one who had sold her the stethoscope, was named Elias Finch. He was the grandnephew of Alistair Finch, the man who now owned most of the valley and lived in a grand house on the far side of the ridge. A man the doctor despised for his arrogance and cruelty. When Clara approached him, not with the ore but with Thorne's letter, his face grew pale. He recognized the name. "Elias Thorne," he said quietly. "My mother always said he was an honest man, that what happened to him was a terrible shame. She believed he was murdered." Dr. Finch read the letter, his hands shaking slightly. He saw not just a crime, but a chance to right a wrong that had haunted his family's name. "My great-uncle Alistair is a powerful man, Clara. He has judges and lawmen in his pocket." "But we have the truth," Clara said, her voice steady. "And we have proof." The doctor nodded, his resolve hardening. "I have my granduncle's old medical journals. He treated Thorne for an injury a week before he died. Perhaps there's something in them." He offered her his knowledge of the law and his access to records. Her third ally was Martha, the boarding house owner. A practical, no-nonsense woman who had seen the town through its long decline, she knew everyone's history. When Clara confided in her, Martha's response was not surprise, but a grim satisfaction. "I knew it," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Men like Alistair Finch don't build fortunes on luck. They build them on the backs of broken men." Martha's contribution was a network of information and support. She knew who was loyal to Finch, who was in his debt, and who nursed a quiet, decades-old grudge. She began bringing Clara meals, her presence a silent statement of solidarity that the rest of the town quickly noted. The rebuilding had begun, not of a structure, but of a legal and moral case, piece by painstaking piece. In the weeks that followed, the Assay office became the quiet center of a slow-burning conspiracy of truth. Jebediah would visit in the evenings, his gnarled finger tracing the tunnels on his old map as Clara read out the locations from Elias Thorne's ledger. They matched perfectly. He would tell her stories of the mine, of the feel of the air in the deep shafts, the taste of the water, the way the silver vein had twisted and gleamed in the lantern light, a living thing in the heart of the rock. He brought her other prospectors, old men with long memories who could corroborate his testimony, men who remembered being told the mine was worthless, while their eyes told them otherwise. Dr. Finch, meanwhile, spent his nights poring over his great-uncle's journals and the county's convoluted legal documents. He found the record of the inquest into Thorne's death, a hasty affair that had concluded with a verdict of accidental fall, despite Thorne being found on flat ground a mile from any cliff. He also found the deeds showing how Alistair Finch and his partners had acquired the mine and thousands of surrounding acres for a pittance in the months following the supposed bust, using a series of shell companies to hide their involvement. The evidence was a web, and with each new thread they uncovered, the picture of Finch's guilt became clearer and more damning. While they worked on the case, Clara worked on the office. She used the last of her money to buy coal and a few basic tools. In the small, stone-walled shed behind the office, she found the remains of Thorne's forge, where he would have fired his crucibles. It was small, but the bellows were sound and the anvil was good steel. She cleaned it out, repaired the flue, and lit the first fire it had seen in 20 years. The familiar scent of burning coal filled the air, a smell of work and purpose. She began taking in small mending jobs from the townspeople, repairing a broken plow blade, sharpening axes, forging a new hinge for a gate. Her work was clean and strong, her welds seamless. The people of Pinto Creek, who had first seen her as a foolish girl, began to see her as something else, a craftswoman. They began to call her Miss Voss, a title of respect. Martha made sure that word of Clara's work spread, and that Finch's men, who had started to watch the Assay office with suspicion, were themselves watched. The women of the town, on their way to the store or to church, always seemed to have a reason to pass by Clara's door, their presence a quiet, formidable shield. The community was not built on grand declarations of friendship, but on these small, repeated acts of practical support. A basket of fresh bread left on her doorstep, a warning about a stranger asking questions, a silent nod of encouragement from across the street. Clara was no longer an outsider. She was becoming part of the town's worn but resilient fabric. The Assay office, once a tomb for a dead man's secrets, was becoming a living place again, filled with the heat of the forge, the smell of food, and the low murmur of voices plotting a quiet revolution. She was no longer just the girl who bought the ruin. She was Clara, the smith, the keeper of the truth, the woman who was patiently hammering out the town's last best hope for justice. The day of reckoning arrived not with a gunshot, but with the dust of 2 riders on the horizon. Dr. Finch, using a trusted contact, had sent a detailed summary of their findings, along with one of Thorne's most compelling ore samples, directly to the territorial marshal in Carson City, bypassing the local authorities entirely. Now, the marshal himself, a tall, grim-faced man named Calloway, had come to Pinto Creek, accompanied by a deputy. They rode straight to the assay office, their arrival sending a ripple of tense anticipation through the town. Clara met them at the door. She laid out everything on the heavy oak counter: Thorne's letter, the ledger with its meticulous entries, and the small canvas bags of ore, each one a silent, glittering witness. She, Jebediah, and Dr. Finch spent 2 hours with the marshal, explaining the evidence piece by piece. Calloway listened intently, his expression unreadable. He examined the ore, hefting it in his hand. He read Thorne's letter twice. When they had finished, he stood up and looked at Clara. "You've done fine work, Miss Voss," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Very fine work." The arrests were swift and quiet. Marshal Calloway and his deputy rode to Alistair Finch's grand house on the ridge. There was no resistance. Finch, now an old man, white-haired and accustomed to absolute authority, seemed more stunned than anything else. His power, built on a 20-year-old lie, crumbled in the face of Thorne's carefully preserved truth. His 2 surviving partners, both prominent figures in the state, were arrested in the following days. The legal proceedings took months, but the evidence was overwhelming. The ledger, the samples, and the testimony of Jebediah and the other old prospectors sealed their fates. The fraudulent sale of the Serpent's Tooth mine was invalidated. The land titles were voided. A measure of justice, long delayed, had finally come to Pinto Creek. The future of the mine was now in the hands of the territorial court. Because of the irrefutable proof he had preserved, the estate of Elias Thorne was granted a foundational claim. As Thorne had no direct heirs, his estate fell to his closest living relative, his grandnephew, Dr. Elias Finch. The young doctor, now free from the shadow of his corrupt great-uncle, approached Clara with a proposal. He offered her a partnership in a new company to reopen the mine, a share in the legacy her patients had unearthed. She was standing in the assay office, now her undisputed home and workshop. The afternoon sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. A small fire crackled in the stove, warding off the autumn chill. The office was no longer a place of ghosts, but a place of purpose, filled with the smells of coal smoke, hot metal, and brewing coffee. On the heavy mantelpiece above the fireplace, 2 objects sat side by side. One was the small iron wolf her father had forged, its patient eyes seeming to watch over the room. The other was a piece of raw ore from Elias Thorne's safe, a beautiful, heavy specimen webbed with veins of pure, gleaming silver. She thought of the 2 men, her father and the assayer, both honest craftsmen who worked with the elemental truths of the earth, one with iron, one with stone. Both had been betrayed by a world that valued clever words and quiet theft over hard work and integrity. Yet both had left something behind, a legacy of truth preserved in metal, waiting for the right hands to find it. Her stepfather had cast her out with nothing, seeing no value in her. The men of Pinto Creek had laughed at her, seeing only a foolish girl. They had all looked at her and seen nothing. But her father had seen a smith. Elias Thorne had trusted in a stranger's patience, and now she was a partner in a silver mine, a respected member of a community, and the owner of a life she had built not with money, but with skill, courage, and the quiet refusal to be dismissed. Clara Voss was 19 and had been homeless. She had $9 to her name, and she spent one of it on a derelict assay office. It was the best dollar she ever spent. The story of Clara Voss is a reminder that the greatest value is often hidden, waiting not for a key, but for the patience to listen. It reminds us that what one person discards as worthless, another can recognize as the foundation of a new life. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found it meaningful, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates tales of quiet strength. And we leave you with this thought. What forgotten or overlooked thing in your own life might hold a hidden truth, just waiting for a patient hand?